ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Before we start today's story, we're very excited to share that tickets for Conversations Live, our national tour, are selling fast. Extra shows have been added in Adelaide, Hobart and Perth. We've got a wonderful show planned for you with special guests, memorable moments and a few surprises along the way. Sarah and I would love to see you. There's a link in the show notes, or you can go to the Conversations page for more details. Today it's the second part of a conversation with Cheng Lei. Cheng Lei is a Chinese-Australian journalist who was detained in China for more than 3 years on espionage charges that centred around her access to a publicly available document. In episode 1, which you can find in the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts, Cheng Lei took us from her early childhood in China's Hunan province to Melbourne, where she grew up, and then to Beijing, where she took on a job as a broadcaster with the English language arm of China's state broadcaster. But one day in 2020, she was called to the office for what she thought was a routine meeting. Instead, she was arrested by China's secret police and ended up spending 3 years in detention, guarded around the clock by 2 officers. She was completely isolated, never given a glimpse of the outside world, and was ordered to sit upright on the edge of her bed for 14 hours a day. Her book is called A Memoir of Freedom. Welcome back, Lei.
Thank you.
When you were inside detention under this RSDL form of detention, what kind of exercise did you get?
The only exercise was walking 1.5 meters between the bed and the curtains, in between the 2 guards, who formed like a 1 meter wide human tunnel.
So this is just 2 steps, 2 steps, 2 steps, 2 steps, something
Yes.
like that? Could you stay in any reasonable shape? Were you physically deteriorating as a result of this?
Absolutely. Hair fell out in chunks. I lost my period. I injured my back. I couldn't move one morning. And my body just felt frozen because I was sitting 14 hours a day.
What were they feeding you? What was the food like?
The food was great. Compared to later on in detention, it was heavenly by comparison, especially if it was a nice officer, because all they do is go to their canteen buffet with these 2 containers and then grab whatever food was on offer. Other officers might not be so nice and they would just get some leftovers.
What kind of control freakery was there about how you passed the hours and the days in that cell?
So I had to sit straight, not cross my legs or ankles.
And what would happen if you did cross your legs or ankles?
They would tell me off.
What, shout at you?
Depends on which guards. Because I was obedient and didn't give them trouble, I just felt that they were just doing their jobs, and they're in the early 20s, out of technical school, not very well educated. They don't really know that they're just part of the torture machine.
So you're being forced to sit up straight with your legs uncrossed?
With no back support on the edge of the bed and sort of facing this person and then having another person sit next to me, but they're not really looking at them. And everyone's uncomfortable, to be honest. I mean, I'm sure for them, who wants to be looking at this poor bugger all day, all night?
What other do's and don'ts were put into your daily routine?
So the lights were always on, and when you tried to sleep, you instinctively tried to cover your eyes with your hands or arms. Can't do that. Can't sleep facing the wall. Can't have your hands inside the doona, which in winter is, again, something you do instinctively. So they'll wake you up if you put your hands in. And You can't close your eyes when you're sitting there.
Oh, you can't
No.
just even zone out like that?
No.
What nicknames did you think up for these young guards who'd been assigned to you?
Well, consider it. It's quite an intimate relationship because you've never been stared at so intently by two people ever for so long. And you're in this room together all the time and you don't know their names. You can't talk to each other. So I tried to pass the time by inventing backstories about them and looking at their features. And they wore masks, so I couldn't see their whole faces. But based on the way they stood or their fingers or their eyebrows, I could concoct some persona about them.
That's such a strange fantasy intimacy. A real and an imagined intimacy that's going on there.
Yeah.
What did you call them? Never out loud, of course, but what did you call them?
My favourite one was Wordsmith, because when I wrote letters and didn't remember some of the Chinese characters, she would tell me how to write it. And she had nicely manicured fingernails, and also she would go off to find how to write it if she didn't know. And she seemed to like books as well.
What about the ones you didn't like?
There was one called Try Hard, and she was, those skits about first day in the military, first day in the army, the meanest officer who tries to discipline the newbies. She was like that. The way she looked at me and talked to me and stood so ramrod straight and always said no to any request I had.
Was there part of you that felt sorry for them? Because their conditions aren't a lot better than yours, are they? Trapped in there?
In some ways, they had it worse, but for shorter spurts of time. So for 4 hours, they had to stand there with masks on, well, half the time standing, half the time sitting, and they couldn't go to the toilet or drink water. The worst was when a guard had the runs, but when she radioed Central Command for a sub and a sub couldn't be sent, she couldn't even use the toilet that was right there in my cell.
So what did she do?
She stood there and crapped her pants in front of me. And I felt so bad for her. And at night, she was crying to her colleague that she had 1/6 of that month's pay docked for being sick.
You were being interrogated, and as you said in the previous episode, quite regularly to begin with, and then they started to taper off. How did the interrogations change over time?
They got more and more disappointed, and I figured that they had nothing more to go on. So all they honed in on was the May 22nd NPC session where I texted the parts of the Premier's work report.
What is the NPC session?
National People's Congress. That's the biggest political gathering in China every year. Usually happens in March, but that year it was postponed to May because of COVID.
So now they're honing in on this document.
Yes.
That was the core of their allegation against you, that you had endangered Chinese state security by sending off information about this public report, but while it was still under embargo,
Yes.
7 minutes ahead
Yes.
of the end of that embargo.
Yes. The embargo that nobody knew about.
And really did never exist, to be honest.
Probably.
You're not much of a spy if that's all they've got on you, are you? Were you a bit offended by that in some ways? I mean, you're not blowing up a naval yard, are you?
I felt like I was in the middle of the darkest satire.
Were you thinking of your friend Hayes, Fan, who you'd sent this information to while you were being interrogated?
I was, because I thought of all the times she asked me for information and how on 2 occasions because I didn't reply to her text in time, she thought that I had been nabbed by the Ministry of State Security. And at the time, I just thought it was paranoia. that she was just being silly. And when I was detained, I thought, if she knew she was endangering me, why was she still asking me for this? Because she told me that the previous year, 2 of her colleagues had been let go by Bloomberg because they were beaten by Reuters by a matter of seconds in reporting on that work report by the Premier. And that's how cutthroat the competition was.
As you're telling me this, and you know so much more about this stuff than I do, the thought that's coming into my head is you're being charged with this preposterous thing that's really no offence at all and wasn't really an offence even to begin with. Like I said, they could have fitted you up with something much worse, but they're charging you with this. It seems like they're making a point. Were they making a point? And what was that point? And did it have anything to do with your Australian nationality?
Well, the first thing they did was deny. They said, "Do you know why you're here?" I said, "Because bilateral relations are bad." And then immediately the response was, "This is not hostage diplomacy."
Which led you to think it was, I suppose.
I just couldn't help think that the denial was too swift and too strong. And once I had my trial, which was much later, when I heard that they started surveilling me in April, just 3 days after our former Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, called for that investigation into the source of COVID.
So you think it was related to Foreign Minister at the time, Maurice Payne, calling for an international investigation into the origins of COVID, having potentially come from that viral lab in Wuhan in China. That angered the Chinese, and they just dragged you out and made an example of you.
And also on the same day, they arrested Sun Lijun, the former deputy head of police, who was the man in charge of cleaning up Wuhan, who had gone to UNSW and who has family, wife and son living in New South Wales. So these are the facts, that this happened. And then I was surveilled, as well as, at least to the extent that I know of, one other Australian. And I was arrested in August. What happened in that intervening period? Were they following me and seeing me go to these embassy events and talk to embassy people, as well as the connection with Hayes? What was their logic and theory?
So that comment from Maurice Payne saying there should be an international investigation into the potential Wuhan leak was the thing that enraged the Chinese government, and that happened directly before you were picked up?
It happened 3 days before they started surveilling me, and perhaps other Australians in China.
And did you put that together in your mind?
No. I just wondered why I was being arrested in August for something that happened in May, and when they were looking through every part of my life, just adamant to make a guilty case.
At what point did you decide there's no point holding out, I might as well confess to this bogus crime?
Well, it's very clear from the outset that you are fucked. From the way they treat you to the level of control and deprivation and isolation. And my lawyers tried to see me, and of course they were turned away. So there was no hope there. And even if they could see me, was that really going to change things?
How often are acquittals in such matters in the Chinese courts?
Never. Unless I did hear of one case where a princeling was put in RSDL and came out after 3 months. But that's because of very powerful political connections.
So you decided to confess. What form did the confession take?
I had to write a confession and write the actual words, "I admit guilt and I accept punishment." And once they had that in the bag and videotaped me reading it out, saying the same thing over and over again, they were happy.
Once you confessed, how did your status change as a detainee or a prisoner?
I mean, in the legal sense, it might have changed, but all I cared about was whether I'll get some company and be able to read more books and have a little bit more freedom.
And did it mean that once you confessed?
Well, by the time I wrote that confession, I was already most of the way into the 6-month limit for RSDL, so I had to go to detention after that.
This meant they had to formally arrest you, didn't they? They
Yes.
hadn't actually arrested you. You're just being held quite to this point. No?
Yeah. And that was the first time I had the handcuffs put on. But to be honest, after RSDL, handcuffs didn't feel like it was any extra layer of incarceration. If anything, after I was officially arrested, I felt freedom went up because I no longer had the guards and I could move.
So you're put into a proper prison at this point?
No, it's a detention centre.
Did you have company at last once they moved you
Yes.
into this detention centre?
I was in a cell with 3 other women, and that made such a huge difference to my sanity.
What were these women like?
Nobody chooses their cellmates, so I would say I would never have picked any of them as my friends. But as a journo, you know, we get along with most people, and we know how to read a room, and we know how to find out what's happening, even the undercurrents, and that's what I try to do.
Were they detained for similar reasons to you, national security related, or were they under criminal charges?
They were all state security cases, but I was told by the eldest inmate there that they used to have some corrupt officials there as well. They couldn't go in the public security system because they were more politically important.
Were you able to go outside at long last at this point?
No. Even the so-called exercise yard was still concrete enclosure like we're here, except with this little strip of window up the top. So it was not like any of the prison scenes that you see on TV where you actually see a bit of empty ground and, you know, prisoners walking around.
Playing basketball, that kind of thing. There wasn't anything like that.
God, no.
Your daughter, by this point, was Ava. She was on the cusp of adolescence when you'd last seen her. Was it really so painful to be missing all these important points in her life while in detention?
Yeah. The guilt I felt and how much I missed her energy and her laughter.
Why guilt? You hadn't done anything wrong.
But I had become a journalist. I had to go and work in China. I had to be good at my job and know all these people and have all these new ideas. I felt all of that was wrong because it led to my not being there.
10 months after your detention, you were at last able to meet with a lawyer, Mr. Wang. What did he advise you to do?
He whispered that he'd really like to enter an innocent plea for me. But I said that's not a good idea. I had been told that flipping the plea is the worst thing you can do and you'll be sentenced even more harshly. And I had found out from an officer that I would likely be sentenced to 6 years. And do you know that that evening I was so happy because I thought, wow, 6 years, that's so much better than the 15 or 20 that I had envisioned. That's how you become just so accepting of the worst.
Your birthday rolled around while in detention. Could you celebrate your birthday while in detention? No?
I ended up celebrating lots of birthdays in many creative ways, but the first birthday I spent in detention, I curled my hair with
How?
toilet tissue, making little strips and then curling my hair on it and hoping that the officers won't notice on the monitors, so that the next morning, on the morning of my birthday, when I had the embassy visit, because I requested that they visit on that day, that I could have a nice hairdo.
How did you try to keep moving Did you do things like yoga while you were confined?
I found exercise to be extremely helpful in keeping the mood calm and get the body producing endorphins so you are not wallowing in misery all the time. And there were only cloth shoes, no bras allowed, and you're wearing this shorts set in a horrible material that does not stretch, so you're quite limited in terms of cardio. I was going to say cardiac arrest, no, cardio exercise. But I tried. I ended up creating quite a name for myself in the detention centre for my exercising.
I wonder if when people like you are going through these awful ordeals, you do attain a degree of self-mastery that the rest of us will never know. Do you think that's true?
It's quite exhausting to stick to that discipline over the mind and the body all the time. You cannot let your mind go to certain places. You have to keep learning, and you have to do ever more reps of the exercises. You have to push yourself, because if you don't, you'll slide backwards. Your brain will atrophy without any stimuli. And I see it happen to my cellmates, and it scares me.
One of my favourite illustrations of how these systems work comes from Alice in Wonderland. There's a moment when Alice is talking, I think it's to the Red Queen, and she says, first comes the execution, then comes the sentence, then comes the trial, and then comes the crime. And Alice says, well, what if there is no crime? And the Red Queen says, so much the better then. So it was with you, Cheng Lei.
Yeah.
Talk of sentencing came before the trial.
Yes.
What were you told about your probable sentence if you did plead guilty to these charges of espionage?
One officer told me 6 years, and then when I met with the prosecutor, he said that he worked so hard for me to get it down to 5 years, and he actually said these words, rock bottom price. Like we were haggling for some $5 trinket at a garage sale.
What was the trial like? Was it one of those kind of howling courtroom dramas like the Stalinist purges, or was it kind of tedious and banal and bureaucratic and boring?
For me, it was a precious excursion outside.
Oh, it was a day trip?
Yeah, it was so exciting. 90 minutes it lasted, and I just stood there in my hazmat suit and adult nappy and tuned myself out to the hateful charges and the testimonies.
Why the adult nappy?
I guess some people lose control of their bowel functions when they're hearing bad news or something.
Did you make a statement to the court?
I did. I kept it really short, and I wanted the judge to send me to jail really quickly so I could see my kids.
Moving forward now then to December 2022, you were allowed a 30-minute phone call with your mum and your kids. What were they able to tell you?
Oh, that was... I cannot describe how much love I felt when I heard their voices again. And I had been given these warnings to not cry, not talk about the conditions at the detention centre, and not to tell my cellmates afterwards. So we had some technical glitches getting the call through, and finally, when I heard my son's voice, I just felt transported, and nothing mattered. And he was just like hugging verbally, and my daughter wanted to cry, but I steered her to talk about happy things like going to Luna Park with her schoolmates, because that was where I used to go as a school kid, at Chadstone Shopping Centre, and we sang the Justin Timberlake song together. And my mum was just crying, but she was doing it silently and just saying my name very softly.
Has anyone in the history of the world felt so fondly about Chadstone's shopping centre?
Exactly.
I mean, the car park's a nightmare for a start.
Now I don't go there. I avoid it because of the parking and the renovations going on. But when I felt all my worries about the kids being ashamed of me or not talking or not happy like they used to be, when those worries went out, I felt such a burden had been lifted.
So after your trial, you were taken back to cell 112
Yes.
to wait for sentencing, and you started singing in your cell. How lovely. What were you singing?
Well, it started Christmas 2021, and gradually I remembered more songs when they were all taught to my cellmates.
Like Bing Crosby Christmas songs, that kind of thing.
Just the old favourites, Silent Night and Jingle Bells.
Christmas carols.
Yes. And after that, a lot of daggy, soppy love songs, Unchained Melody, Lady in Red. And then I started to ask Nick, my partner, to send me lyrics via the embassy. But I only had a few hours to read the letters, so I would need to memorize all the lyrics, and then the letters would get taken away, so then I could teach them from what I had memorized.
There was a strange communication system that started up that involved knocking on the walls. How did it work?
So because of COVID, they decided we couldn't go into the exercise enclosure, and instead they would open everyone's doors to the exercise enclosure for 30 minutes in the mornings. And I started singing there because the acoustics were good. And then I heard a man's voice from next door say, 112, that's our cell number, love your singing. And that made me really happy. So I kept on singing. Then we started to illicitly talk because that was so dangerous with the guards patrolling on top of us. We decided to use an alphabet code to communicate during the day when the doors were closed.
How did that work?
So Z is 26 knocks and A is
right.
1 knock.
Wow.
Yes. And
Right.
I would then later conduct my most physically taxing interview ever, asking my cellmates what they did, where they went to university, what their hobbies were, and getting very sore arms.
God, that must have taken so long to tap out a sentence.
We had a lot of time.
Did you get caught?
We were eventually, because we got carried away talking at the entrance to the exercise enclosure. And we were punished. Well, I was punished because I just said it was just me, even though another cellmate tried to dob in Canto, the cellmate I was trying to protect. The officers didn't want to make more work for themselves, so I was the one that got the punishment.
And what was the punishment?
Just sitting for 3 days and writing a 6-page self-criticism. So instead of the usual, you can exercise, you can walk around, I just had to sit.
At one point, your warden started a monthly competition between the various cells. What was this competition? How did it work?
I think that was to get us more ready for jail. And we had to compete on neatness, cleanliness, not breaking any rules, and making our bedding look extremely uniform with knife edges.
And who had the cell with the most pristine beds? Did you win, or how did you go?
We won a few times, and the prizes were substantial. We got to watch a movie of our choosing.
What was the movie?
Weekend. We chose a Bond movie with Daniel Craig. And I remember there was this tropical shower scene, And we kept saying, "Oh my God, lower, lower!" For the camera to pan down to, and then it stopped tantalizingly just short of the V of the. Yeah.
Well, you're only human, and you had been detained. Wow.
We hadn't seen any
male beefcake for quite some time.
For years, yeah.
Right. All this time, you still hadn't been officially sentenced.
No, and that happens to all of us. The wheels of state security, ministry, justice are so slow, they're almost not moving.
Maybe they couldn't figure out themselves what to do.
And they say, "Oh, it's for your own good. This shows how concerned we are for your sentence, that we're taking such a long time to decide," which is great. Yeah, 7 to 8 years in one room with 3 sane people. Yeah, you really want that.
One point, amazingly, you received an interesting proposal from a fellow detainee. Can you tell me about this proposal?
So he was the chief Knox person from cell 111.
The one you were talking to?
Yes.
All that.
He had the best knocks because they were very clear and easy to decipher. And he was very creative in terms of sending messages. And he managed to get a book to me and made markings on it that was like a love letter. And he highlighted with tang, that orange
powdered orange juice
powder.
Right,
yeah. That was our only source of vitamin C, because we couldn't buy fruit at the time. And he used tang to colour a bit in the book that says, "Will you marry me?" And, But then they moved him from the cell once all this was discovered.
It's really moving.
I'd love to find him and meet him.
Do you know his name?
I do.
You can't say that, of course.
I don't know if they would want me to say the name or not. I don't know if it harms them, and that's why I've changed some of the details in the book to protect them.
While you were waiting and waiting and waiting, you wrote a love letter to Australia.
Yeah.
That you wanted the consulate to make public. What did you write about?
I wrote about all the things I missed terribly and loved intensely about Australia.
What were those things?
The sun, space, nature, and friendly people. And all of that is in extreme short supply where I was, or non-existent.
What did you do with that letter?
So I had to, once I got the idea, I had to write it in my head, because you don't get a pen. You just don't have access to any writing utensils or paper. And I would craft it in my head and try to memorize it, because they never tell you which day you're going to be visited on. So I just had to be ready at all times. And once I dictated it at the visit, walking out of the room, I turned around and said, "Can you please make this public?" And then the next day, when my lawyer visits me, he says, "Your dad doesn't want it to be publicized." I felt very hurt, because I have no voice. I am so helpless. But I do know my predicament. And my dad thinks, of course his intentions are good. He thinks I'm going to cop flack for this. But the way I thought about it, I'm not bashing the Communist Party in that letter. I'm just saying how much I miss Australia and how much I love it.
Was the letter released?
Thankfully, Nick gets me, my partner, and he read it out on 7:30 with Sarah Ferguson. And I found out about it the next month. And yes, there was backlash. They didn't give me any books or clothes or letters after that. And they lied about it, telling the embassy they were renewing their review process. But once the Australian embassy checked with other embassies, the lie was blatant.
So finally, September 2023, this is more than 3 years after your arrest.
Yeah.
You were taken in for sentencing.
Yes.
How did that unfold?
I thought it would just be standard, because the prosecutor would recommend 5 years, and 95% of the time the judge just takes up that recommendation. So I'm sitting in my holding cage at the courthouse doing my memory exercises, African countries and capitals, and the judge waltzes over smiling. And of course I am very disconcerted because he's never smiled at me before. And I've seen him plenty of times at all the embassy visits. And he says, "How many years do you think you'll be sentenced to?" I said, "I don't know. I had a nightmare that it was 8 years." And he kept smiling and said, "I think you'll be satisfied with the sentence." So that just threw my mind into utter disarray. No calm whatsoever. There goes the serenity. Even going to the toilet and seeing myself for the first time in 3 years in the mirror didn't shock me out of that confusion. And thankfully, the sentencing was fairly short. And when I heard 2 years and 11 months, I knew immediately that I would be free in just over 2 weeks, because RSDL only counts as half the time, so 6 months only count as 3 months. That's why even though I was there for 3 years and 2 months, the sentence was actually only for 2 years and 11 months.
So then what happened on the day of your release?
When the sentence was up, I had to go to a halfway house, a very secret location, because the Supreme Court needed to ratify the intermediate court's verdict because it was so low. And I was there for 3 days, watched by, it was a big operation. There were about a dozen officers who booked out this hotel on the outskirts of Beijing.
Wow, you're such a bad, dangerous human being, aren't you?
Oh, I just...
Wow,
I'm
incredible.
such a disappointment.
Right.
I can't bust out of any jail.
Right, it requires hundreds of people to hold you down.
Yeah,
pin you down.
and watch me when I sleep.
Wow, public enemy number one.
Exactly.
Cheng Lei. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
that's right.
So you're in this halfway house.
Yeah, and it's already very, very weird because all the things that were banned in detention. Do you know that the toothpaste cap is not allowed in detention?
What's the thinking behind that?
We surmised that somebody must have tried to swallow it, and so they were banned. So we had to make out of some scrap piece of packaging a little cap for the toothpaste so it doesn't dry up. But that's how maximum security it was.
Right, but in the halfway house, was there a cap on the toothpaste?
Yes, there was everything. There were bottles, there was a string on which to hang laundry.
What was your mind blown by all this spectacular luxury?
Like
Right.
just not having to squat to do everything, like having a basin to stand in front of to wash everything. Because we had just had 3 years. Well, I had been washing everything by hand, squatting, because the bathroom tap is at a shin level. So you have to wash your dishes on the floor, you have to wash your food on the floor, your food containers on the floor, your clothes on the floor. Good glutes.
What happened on the day of your release?
I had to write another self-expose about how I felt, about, how much I regretted hurting my birth country and how I have learned from this process and I'm never going to do bad things again. And
Did you have to write a personal apology to Xi Jinping or someone like that for your terrible crime?
I didn't write a personal apology. I just wrote a general one. Finally, that passed muster and they kept lying to me that they were going to go out to buy an airfare. Like, who in this day and age goes out at 9 o'clock on a Monday night to buy an airfare? And when in fact they weren't buying the airfares, the embassy had booked tickets for me on like airfares on every flight that night, that week. So why the bullshit?
So that night you're finally taken to the airport and put on a plane to Melbourne. Kind of recreation of that journey you did all those years ago when you came over as a girl.
Yeah.
What point do you feel free, like as a free person, on that journey?
I think I had already discovered internal freedom towards the end of my incarceration. So it's not about where I am or what I'm doing or what I'm allowed to do, but a way of thinking.
You're talking about like finding some kind of irreducible core. Is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely. That they can't touch, no matter where they put me or how they strip me. And that's, whereas I think when we're physically free, sometimes we're not, because we constrain ourselves with fear or even love.
So you're back in Australia and you're with your kids again. I'm not going to ask you how happy you were, because it's a stupid question. That holding them again must have been wonderful.
But it was also almost overwhelming to have all these sensations rushing at me. It was a windy day, and you never feel the wind because you're always inside. So even that was like, my skin was screaming, like, what is this feeling? And
of wind, right.
Yeah. Or rain.
And a horizon as well?
Oh, the horizon bit was about a month later when I went on 7:30 with Sarah Ferguson, and I had to fly to Sydney and seeing it from the plane. And just the fact that I used to stare at this window up the top where I couldn't see anything and try to imagine the sense of space, and then to have it in front of me. I mean, my seatmate must have thought I was crazy. Like, it's only Sydney, mate. What are you crying for? And it was spectacular.
So not long after, you got back on the horse. You took a job as a journalist with Sky News. How did it feel to do that, to become a journalist again? Was there ever any doubt in your mind that you'd do that again?
Oh, in detention, I didn't think I would be employable as an ex-con. And
really? That thought entered your head?
A little, and maybe tainted by, state security ministry charges. Because that's what happens in China. You're forever tarred.
Have you kept any habits that you had while you were in detention?
I do yoga, and I still have a lot of that Zen. When people honk at me, or even when they're rude to me, it doesn't faze me. And I keep saying to people who are late for an appointment with me, it's okay, I'm used to waiting.
Man, you're an expert in waiting.
I am. I know all the tricks.
Everything that happened to you in detention, or anything that happens to any critic of that regime or of the regime of Vladimir Putin or North Korea and the like, do you see that as a sign of strength or as a sign of weakness of the state?
Weakness? How insecure do you have to be to not let these inmates see family or correspond with family? How flimsy do their cases have to be for them to be so paranoid about a birthday sign made with packaging. They are so scared. And that's why they're so paranoid and have all these rules.
It's a really big question, but how have you changed?
In many ways. I'm more fearless. And if life was a buffet, I used to graze at it. Now I'm full on pigging out, stuffing my face in every way. I'm much more appreciative of life and human connection, because I'll always remember those desperate months where I longed to make any small talk with the doctors doing their rounds or the guards. Any conversation. So when I get in a car, in an Uber, I always talk to the drivers. And when I can do something nice, even the smallest thing for somebody else, I always do it, because it's not all the time that you get the chance to show kindness. And it makes a huge difference to the recipient.
So many of us were following your story while you were in detention.
I'm so moved by that.
I'm so pleased you're sitting here talking to me face to face, and that you're
Thank
well.
you.
And
Better than well.
Better than well.
I'm kicking ass.
Long may you do so.
Thank
Cheng Lei,
you.
I've so enjoyed this conversation with you. It's been incredibly moving and powerful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheng Lei's book is called Cheng Lei, A Memoir of Freedom. And there's a documentary called Cheng Lei, My Story, made by Sky News Australia. It's going to be available to stream at skynews.com.au. Today's conversation with Cheng Lei was made on the lands of the Gadigal people. A producer was Maggie Morris. Executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.